Hello, my name is Akash Kumar. I'm a visiting assistant professor in the Department of French and Italian at Indiana University, Bloomington, a Dante scholar for a long time now, with interests ranging from intellectual history and material culture and games and popular versus high culture. And for me, we're talking about Paradiso 19 here, and for me, this is a canto that has enormous personal significance as well that we'll talk about shortly.
And I'm Danielle Callegari. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of French and Italian at Dartmouth College. I'm a counselor on the board of the Dante Society of America, and my colleague and friend Akash and I have many shared interests. Most of those come together at the table. His games meet my food, and our interest particularly in community construction, building, and universality and accessibility are themes that have drawn us together and that drew us both to Paradiso 19 today, as Akash has already alluded to. But what I think makes us most excited about talking about this canto is how incredibly relevant it is right now. I think the question everybody has been asking themselves lately is how do we understand Dante's relevance, or why read Dante now, today, in a moment that feels like there are some much more immediate pressing concerns that we need to give our attention to. And what we found when we started talking about Paradiso 19 together was that actually Dante allowed us to approach those burning questions and those really difficult issues in a surprisingly subtle and nuanced way, and really facilitated that conversation for us. And we hope it does the same for everyone who's joining us here. Akash, this canto is a canto that you have spent a lot of time in, and that I have spent a lot of time avoiding, because I work a lot with the center Paradiso, with Dante's encounter with Cacciaguida, his ancestor, who comes just before this and announces to Dante that he will eventually be sent into exile, and he will know that state of exile by the strange food that he eats. And I've spent some time in the canto just following this, particularly Paradiso 21, where Dante kind of rails against the obese clergy who kind of in their body type reveal their lack of concern for those who have not enough in their community. But 19 represents a different question of community that isn't so much focused on the feeding and conviviality or lack thereof, but rather on a much more kind of directed, pinpointed question of justice, of human justice, of God's justice, and of our ability to act in that space. And I know that you've come at this from a very kind of organic vision, starting even from a little earlier. So maybe you could take us into it.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's exactly right. I think Paradiso 19 really stands out. It's an exceptional space, surrounded, as you've said, by a lot of interesting, more locally oriented material. And Paradiso 19 explodes in terms of scale. It really takes us in a global direction. Still thinking about issues of justice and exclusion, but doing so in a remarkably expanded way. So we're already kind of transitioning from the heaven of Mars, where we've met Cacciaguida, Dante's great ancestor, to the heaven of Jupiter that Paradiso 19 represents a part of. And we've already done that at the end of Paradiso 18. And so our introduction to the heaven of justice is the gathered souls coming together and spelling out a biblical verse, which is Diligite justitiam qui judicatis in terram. Love justice, you who rule the earth. So already this kind of pointed reminder about the intersections of politics and justice. It's the responsibility of those who hold power, who have any kind of authority, to be just, to exercise their power justly and appropriately. And so we have a really fascinating transformation already, kind of thinking about Paradiso as an experimental space of poetry for Dante, and the way that he just creates a remarkable amount of new language, and he's really just trying to wow us, and very often succeeding in wowing us through how much he gets us to just embody the text ourselves. So we go from all of these souls coming together and spelling out this biblical verse, and then we have the M of the very last verse transforming into an eagle that then I'll throw it back to Danielle, and you can take us through that eagle taking flight at the beginning of the canto here.
Yeah, it's so smooth a transition as you're describing it, Akash. I'm almost newly impressed, even after having read this so many times and having just kind of reviewed it together, at the way that the narrative, the poetry, the theme, the pilgrim himself, the reader, everything moves so beautifully through from one space to the other, from an idea that is presented in words to an image that rises up literally and figuratively for the pilgrim and the reader at the same time. And as we enter into Paradiso 19, Dante gives us that image, as you say, so beautifully. Parrea dinanzi a me con le ali aperte, la bella immagine che nel dolce frui liete faceva l'anime conserte. Parrea ciascun rubinetto in cui raggio di sole ardesse sì acceso che nei miei occhi rifrangesse lui. What he's describing here is these souls coming together, lighting up, creating what will become the image of an eagle. And as we get to the end of those terzine, of just that initial description, Dante says, "Ch'io vidi e anche udì parlar lo rostro, e sonare nella voce e io e mio, quando era nel concetto e noi e nostro." He sees this now what we know will become, or known as to us, the eagle of justice, speaking. We're in this space where sound and image and all perception is sort of in this gray area for Dante, or actually I should say in this kind of brilliant lighted up area where it's not clear how his senses are working. He's receiving in some way. He is becoming greater than the human existence permits us to understand this kind of perception. And he hears this being before him saying, I and me, or mine, noi and ours, right? He is us and we, I and my. He's creating for us through the language and through this space a kind of foundation, a platform on which he will build a profound and complex discussion about community and justice and where we stand in that space. And Paradiso 19 is about many things, and we don't have time for all of them, but there's one piece of the puzzle here that really has to take your attention, and that, as we said, just catapults you into a 21st century discussion right away. And Akash, I know that this is something that is particularly close to your heart, because as somebody approaching the poem for the very first time, you would have seen yourself speaking of the specchio here and how the reader inserts themselves into the space. That this was a canto that spoke to you specifically. So, how and why is that the case for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm going to set it up before I go into a little bit of my personal narrative and how this canto resonated for me from the very first time that I read the poem. I want to just dwell really briefly on how it can still resonate to us as 21st century readers, and the way that we can kind of think about text and image and relating to popular culture. And the California artist Sandow Burke is someone whose work I've admired for a long time. He's done this really fascinating illustration of the poem, and his version of the eagle of justice is something that I want to show you here. And it's, of course, very brilliantly represented as the M, the ubiquitous M of McDonald's. So Danielle, of course, this intersects a little bit with your interests in terms of one of Burke's longstanding critiques is against American excess and gluttony and right what McDonald's represents in that regard, but also kind of this sense of a global culture that, of course, is maybe not global in the best of ways. I mean, it's one culture imposing itself on others, but nonetheless, kind of thinking about how we are bound together as a community, as a global community, around certain symbols, around certain ways of thinking about ourselves. And the M of McDonald's is something that I think is a very clever approach by Burke to take to get us to really hone in on how we still do this to this day. But for me, anyway, I think what really grabs me, what grabbed me as a young 13-year-old reading this poem for the very first time, is the remarkably pointed question that is asked in Paradiso 19. And that question is not just one of human justice. We got introduced to the canto by way of thinking about human justice, love justice, you who rule the earth, right? Political justice. In this case, it's a question of divine justice. And that question is, how is it possible to exclude, to condemn someone who is born outside of the boundaries, outside of the cultural boundaries of Christianity, and yet is good in everything that they do? And this isn't just an abstract example, but it's an example that Dante puts into a very specific geographical space, to the furthest reaches of the world as he knew it. But of course, those furthest reaches for Dante are the closest reaches for me personally. So I'm going to read you the particular form of the question that is asked. Che tu dicevi, un uomo nasce alla riva dell'Indo, e quivi non è chi ragioni di Cristo, né chi legga né chi scriva, e tutti i suoi voleri e atti buoni sono, quanto ragione umana vede, senza peccato in vita e in sermoni. Muore non battezzato e senza fede. Ov'è questa giustizia che il condanna? Ov'è la colpa sua se non crede? So it's really a remarkable question that's asked. I mean, positing this individual who is good in all of their ways, and the only fault of theirs, they've died unbaptized, they can't be admitted into a Christian afterlife, but their only fault is that they didn't have an opportunity to learn about Christ. They didn't have a chance to get, to earn their way in. And that's a question that of exclusion that Dante has posed for a long time. In fact, I mean, he characterizes this question in this canto as something that he has been thinking about for a long time, a burning question, a burning doubt. And it's a question that we have known from the very first moments of Inferno, when we are confronted with the Roman poet Virgil as our guide, and the idea of Virgil, who is good in all his ways and who is a poetic guide, a great deal of a great inspiration for Dante, and yet is excluded from the Christian afterlife because, of course, he too died unbaptized. He died before the advent of Christianity. So in some ways, when we get to Limbo and Inferno 4, the question, the problem is one of time. Those individuals who were good and excellent and promoted human activity in the best of ways, and yet they were born early and couldn't get there. But at the same time, even in Limbo, we have those individuals who are calling into question these geographical and cultural boundaries as well. We have Muslims in limbo. We have Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina, Averroes and Avicenna. We have Salahuddin, Saladino, and these are Muslim individuals who, of course, did live after Christ, and who therefore did have access and possibility on that front, and chose not to exercise it. And yet they have that place of pride and honor that is limbo, and that's interesting as well. But for me personally, of course, this man born on the banks of the Indus reminds me of my father, who was born not far from the banks of the Indus, and that just allows someone like me, someone who looks like me, to have access into this this paradigm of European culture, something that's acknowledged as one of the great works of literature. That is the founding moment of Italian literature, as many have put it. And for me to be able to see myself reflected in Dante's doubt here is something really special.
Well, and it's interesting. I think what's coming through as you're talking is how these questions that Dante is posing that start with chronology, as you point out in Inferno, especially in terms of who has access when, and then come to this much more pointed question of geography and of these more fluid and harder to define cultural boundaries also. What I think maybe comes out of them at the end of our reading of the poem in its fullness is that what Dante is suggesting here is not that an answer to these questions will bind us, but rather the posing of these questions is what binds us, right? As humans across time and space, we must and we will ask ourselves where our community begins and ends, and where our form of justice begins and ends, our enacting of that justice, our responsibility, where those lines are drawn is all part of human existence, part of what makes us human, and part of what lifts all of those boundaries and or transcends them and makes them less valuable is the posing of the question, right? And that's what I come away from Paradiso 19 with. There is no answer, right? As you progress, what the eagle will tell Dante is, your pathetic human form cannot understand God's justice. So there's, there's
exactly. There's no point in asking, and yet I think it's the question that matters more. I mean, yes, that the answer is that brush off essentially, and yet I think it's the question that still matters, and giving specific groups shout outs, I think really makes that question resonate all the more. So we have the man born on the banks of the Indus, and then we go on to later in the canto in line 108, we have the Ethiopian who will condemn Christians who say Christ, Christ, and in fact it's the Ethiopian who's going to end up saved instead of those Christians who are making outward demonstrations of faith. And then we have the Persians who will put European rulers to shame. And again, so we start out kind of in this abstract realm, if you like, in terms of thinking about an individual who is virtuous in all their ways. And then we move back to that political, so that Persians are a really interesting choice, kind of thinking about political identity. And we've had the Persian monarch Xerxes come up earlier in the poem in Paradiso and Purgatorio. But what this ends up leading into to end the canto is a diatribe against current European rulers in favor of Persians. So Persians might say to the kings of Europe that they are terrible. And the Persians come off looking a whole lot better. Really interestingly, there are a lot of names that are dropped at the end of Paradiso 19. And we have Dante kind of playing again with this idea of text and image. So these terzine, start out with an L, li vedrà, li si vedrà, and then we have vedrasi la lussuria, vedrasi, and then we have e faranno e quel. So we get LVE or L-U-E in more Latinate scribal language. And that's the word lue, which is plague. So of course, we're thinking a lot about plague and disease in the here and now, but thinking about that connection between plague and politics, political misrule and mismanagement, and how that's a plague, both metaphorical and physical, for us here in 2020 even. The way that that connection kind of still resonates so much from the 14th century to the here and now, I think is a remarkable thing.
I couldn't say it better myself, and so I won't, because you've concluded us in an absolutely perfect way there, Akash. But I will just add that, to underline your point and put an exclamation point on it, we are, kind of racing through a quick conversation about a canto that we might spend hours or days talking about and pondering different elements of. But as you demonstrated very quickly, there is so much here that we could say is speaking directly to each of us as individuals, you and I, our community as people who read Dante a lot and think about how Dante might be related to issues of interest right now within academic life and outside of it, but also to this whole world, right? And it just points us towards the thing that makes me love Dante the most, and that I feel like maybe is a nice way to put a bow on this, is the universality and accessibility, right? And that's the question that drives Paradiso 19, but that also drives us to keep coming back to him. This feeling that even when the answers are inadequate, the questions are enlightening and are just, are so expansive, so global in their attempts, right? And so we all fall short, right? That's kind of like the message that Dante is giving us, and the message that this world is giving us right now is we all fall short. But by engaging, we do the work that needs to be done. And so that feels energizing to me when I read this right now and I talk to you.
And it's by reading. It's by all of the language in this canto that's oriented towards the production of text and the reading of text, and how important that is. So we've just got to keep reading.
I couldn't agree more. Maybe we should get back to it now then.
Yeah, that's right. We'll stop there.
It's been a pleasure, Akash.
My pleasure.